I'm at the WorkLab 2014 in Vilnius with Sarah, who's been very involved in organising this WorkLab. Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name's Sarah Brooks. I'm a research fellow at the University of Sheffield, and I'm in my third year of a PhD, and I'm looking at the role of formal and informal communication and how that affects the way that employees speak to their managers.
Okay, so tell us a bit more about your research. What are you looking at in more detail?
So I'm working with the police, and what I'm particularly interested in is understanding how do people define informal and formal communication. So what types of channels would they use in order to speak to their manager? And the real thing that I'm interested in is the literature would suggest that formality causes silence, and what I'm interested in understanding is how do employees use informal communication? So maybe chats in the corridor or chats over coffee, and how do they use that in order to give managers information in an informal way rather than being constrained by the formality that often prevents people from talking to each other.
And what sort of things are you finding?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. So I've done my research in 2 different organisations at the moment. I did a pilot study in a local authority organisation, and what I found, looking at people at the bottom of an organisation, so employees and first-line managers, and what I found there was that there was very little evidence that they were unable to speak to their manager, and that seems to be because they work very closely. So they sit in the same space, they share the same desk space, and therefore the first-line manager was very involved in the day-to-day operational business, and therefore there was very little fear of speaking to their manager. So that was interesting because that kind of went against what the literature would suggest. My main study is going to be done in the police force, so I did a pilot study in the police to see whether the preliminary results would be the same as they were in the local authority, and I found something completely different. So I used constables and sergeants, so the 2 bottom levels of the organisation, and again I found that there was very little evidence of silence because they work, again, very closely together, involved in day-to-day operations. But I'm particularly interested in understanding how employees pass bad news or difficult information, because that's what the literature would suggest we are naturally predisposed to withhold. And what I found was that the culture in the police has successfully managed to reverse any natural predisposition that we have to share difficult information. So as an organisation, they need to know bad information, bad news quickly so they can deal with it. So they've incentivised the constables to give them bad news as quickly as possible, and if they don't do that and they're later found out to have withheld information, they can get in a lot of trouble for that. So I thought that was really interesting, the cultural aspect of that.
Do you have any thoughts about how some of those findings and some of the work of communication organisations can be more generally important for organisations?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. So I think there's a view about case studies. So in effect, my PhD will be a case study because it's only looking at one police force in the country. However, within the police force, I think there's a general recognition that many police forces are the same because of the very strong hierarchy and the command and control culture. So what I'm hoping is that although I found what I found in one police force, it will be largely generalisable to the other 41 that are in the country, and that they'll understand and be able to take lessons from that as well.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the tools that practitioners can use to try and improve communication in organisations?
So one of the ones that we've used at the WorkLab here is something called communicative space. And this is a fairly revolutionary idea, I think, and certainly not very widely used in organisations. So if you think of the power differences in organisations and how employees often withhold information from managers because managers have the power to allow careers to progress, or they could prevent it also. Communicative space is a way of allowing employees to speak openly with each other, so no manager involvement, and be responsible for having their voice heard and deciding what they think is important to them and not having a manager decide what they think is important. And I think that's quite a difficult concept for many people to understand, because we're so used to the different power levels that we've got in all levels of society. So we've been looking at that in the WorkLab and having a look at how that can completely change the things that we know about employees, and it can make them feel safer and therefore more willing to speak up.
So is communicative space a physical space?
Yeah, it can be. It can be a physical space. So I think what my research showed is that if your manager and your employees sit together, a lot of the natural barriers are broken down so people communicate more freely. Also, I think it's about mental space, and it's about allowing people to understand the things that they feel constrained by, so questioning why don't they speak up, and allowing them to realise that they're no longer there. And I think often people are very surprised by the types of things they say, because we naturally withhold things, and I think we don't necessarily realise. So yeah, it can be a physical and a mental space.
And if people were interested in learning more about the communicative space, can you point them at some resources that they could use?
Yeah, so I work with a lady at Sheffield University, Diane Burns, who's pioneering this method, and she's a voice and silence researcher too, and she's very committed to allowing marginalised groups or people that are often unable to be heard. She's very committed to making sure that that happens. So there's a number of papers that I'd be able to provide to the WorkLab participants that could allow them to get more of an idea about communicative space.